This episode is brought to you in partnership with the Colorado chapter of the Nature Conservancy and TNC chapters throughout the western United States. Guided by science and grounded by decades of collaborative partnerships, the Nature Conservancy has a long-standing legacy of achieving lasting results to create a world where nature and people thrive. On the last Tuesday of every month throughout 2024, Mountain Prairie will be delving into conversations with a wide range of the Nature Conservancy's leaders, partners, collaborators, and stakeholders, highlighting the myriad of conservation challenges, opportunities, and solutions in the American West and beyond. To learn more about the Nature Conservancy's impactful work in the West and around the world, visit www.nature.org. This is the Mountain Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guest today is Nichole Barger. Nichole is an ecologist, former university professor, and the current deputy chief scientist and lead global scientist for the Nature Conservancy. She earned her master's degree from the University of California at Berkeley and her PhD from Colorado State, and her career has included extensive time researching, teaching, and practicing on-the-ground frontline conservation on issues including land degradation and restoration issues. Prior to assuming her current position at TNC, she was the research director of the Canyonlands Research Center, located at TNC's Dugout Ranch, which you may remember as the subject of a Mountain Prairie episode back from August of 2024. Given her distinguished career as a scientist, you might be surprised to learn that Nichole never considered pursuing science as a vocation until the second half of her time in college. She grew up in small-town Indiana, and although she was extremely curious, a great student, and a voracious reader, she was not particularly enamored with science and didn't know anyone who worked as a scientist. But during college, a supportive yet casual comment from one of her professors planted the seed that science could be an option. Fast forward to today, she's published more than 70 peer-reviewed papers, she co-chairs the Science Policy Interface Group of the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, and she leads many of TNC's cutting-edge science initiatives. As you'll hear, Nichole brings a deep level of empathy, curiosity, and open-mindedness to all of her work as a scientist. Whether she's teaching, researching, or working with conservation stakeholders, she never loses sight of the importance of human connection. We spent the first half of the conversation discussing lessons learned from her non-traditional path into the world of science, including a 2-year stint where she left college to travel and explore the United States. We talked about her renewed focus on academics when she returned to school, and the moment that professor planted the seed that eventually grew into her career in science. We discussed teaching versus research, how she evolved as an educator and mentor to college students, and when she decided to apply her talents to TNC's mission. We talk about TNC's incorporation of Indigenous wisdom and science into its work, human health as a conservation initiative, and the importance of face-to-face human interactions. She also offers some excellent book recommendations and ideas for remaining optimistic and action-oriented during challenging times. There's so much wisdom packed into this episode, so be sure to check out the episode notes for a complete list of all the topics and links to everything. A huge thanks to Nichole for the great conversation, and thank you for listening. All right, Nichole, we are recording, and I just really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me. We're recording this on Thanksgiving week, and we'll be putting it out the same week, and so I know everybody's got a lot going on, but I'm really excited to chat with you because, as we were saying before we started recording, we've got a lot of overlap between past guests and past interests. And I actually used to live in Boulder, where I know that you've lived and taught for a long time. And so just to start out, I'd love to hear about your professional journey and kind of how you ended up doing this work that you do. Can we just start at the beginning? Where did you grow up?
Yeah, I'm just so happy to be here and excited to talk to you today. And I'm so glad you asked me that first question about where I grew up, because it really informs a huge amount of how I think about the world. So I grew up in the Midwest in a town called Wheatfield, Indiana. So it's a town of 700 people and 7 churches. So we had a church per 100 people. And my grandparents were farmers, and it was, and still is, a farming community. And when I think about my journey from rural Indiana to where I am now, there was no path or thinking that I was going to become a scientist and become a professor. It was just not really part of the equation of where I grew up. But I think the most important thing for me growing up is that I was an avid reader, that I learned about the world and about all of these other different worlds out there by reading and just being a curious person. So that was really that formative time for me, was just being a curious person. And when you think about becoming a scientist, everyone thinks, oh, you were just smart and knew what you wanted to do the entire time of growing up. But my path was incredibly nonlinear to getting to where I am today. I spent time, going to undergrad, and I majored in political science and journalism. And then I took 2 years off and decided to wander around and travel across the United States. I did van life before that was a thing during that time, and just really explored the world in a really curious, open way. And that's when I recognized in the 90s that the incredible impact that we were having on our environment, and was really drawn to that work. That's really interesting. And just from those few sentences there, I think we could easily spend like 3 hours talking about pre-PhD. But I'm curious, you going to school, then taking some time off and exploring the country. How did your folks take that? I mean, like when you announced that you were going to go off and do something different like that, were your parents supportive of that idea, or was it, because it seems like I grew up in the southeastern U.S. in a small town as well, and there's kind of a certain way that people go about doing things. You know, you get out of high school and you go to college and then you get a job. And I actually had a very kind of all over the place path myself. And thankfully my parents were super supportive, but I'm always curious how people's parents reacted when they're going on these kind of journeys that they don't really know where they're going at the time. My parents reacted incredibly well. And I was super fortunate that I look back now as a parent, and I just realized that they didn't say anything. They let me do my thing, but it was, for growing up where I grew up, it was not easy. I'm sure it wasn't easy for them to see their daughter just go out wandering around the country. And the joke, so my mom was a beautician and had her own beauty salon. And so I grew up in a Steel Magnolias, if anyone remembers that. Oh yeah, I remember movie, that. Steel Magnolias sort of way, with all the farm grandmas. And everyone knew that the whole time I was growing up, that I was a curious and kind of the free spirit. And so what an amazing gift to have this small community I grew up in some ways have question marks about what I was doing, but at the same time, celebrating that I was just out there in the world exploring. So I was pretty fortunate in that way. I mean, there were a few comments of like, how long is she going to stay in school, when I was getting my PhD? But, par for the course. Yeah, that's how it goes, especially small towns. Thinking about that 2 years you mentioned when you took a break, when you look back now, it's real easy to draw a line between all the experiences when you're looking back. But what were some of the big takeaways from that time? I'm so glad we're talking about this too, because I looked at your LinkedIn, but obviously I didn't, there was nothing on there about van life before van life. So, yeah, exactly. I mean, looking back, what did you learn, and how did that kind of change your trajectory during that time? I think the biggest thing that I learned was to trust myself. And even though I grew up a confident person, just the ability to be a young woman, I was 21, and to strike off on my own, to have my own van, and to explore the world, and to just really trust in myself, and to also trust my own intuition. That was probably the most important thing that I learned, because at that time I had all of these friends that were finishing undergrad. They were going to graduate. And here I was, in some ways, the dropout at that point. So I hadn't gone to do my master's. I hadn't done my PhD. And to feel confident in my own decisions about myself, and to know that, no, I'm not doing this because I'm not smart or I can't make it, but I'm doing it to just to make sure that I understand myself and the potential part that I play in this world.
And were there any particular books you read, maybe in your teen years, that you would say kind of influenced you or gave you the confidence or gave you the, even knowing that such a thing was an option to take time off like that? Were there any particular books that you remember from that time that were highly influential in this journey?
Well, I have to say, I read all of the Lord of the Rings during my math class, which was probably a poor choice on my part during high school. But I think what that reflected was just that of these different cultures coming together for a common purpose.
Mm.
And I know that many people read Lord of the Rings in high school, but for me, that was actually one of, I don't think I knew anyone in high school that read Lord of the Rings during high school, or also A Wrinkle in Time. That was actually put on a back shelf. It wasn't forbidden or banned exactly, but it was definitely put on a back shelf because it was considered non-Christian. Mm. So I would say those were the formative books of thinking about how the world works and how we all work together for a common purpose.
That's interesting you say that, because just last night, my oldest daughter, she's just kind of gotten through all the Harry Potter books and she's looking for a new something to dive into, and was asking about the Lord of the Rings. And I've never read them. I mean, I've seen maybe one or two of the movies, but I never really got into that. But hearing you say that, I'm going to order those things up and give it the ringing endorsement, because
yes,
that's pretty cool.
Highly.
That's the timing of that is really funny. Very interesting. So you go back to school after taking this break. What were you like then? Like was it a renewed focus, new interest? How did you kind of go after school when you're after this break?
When I went back to school after that break, I went to a fantastic school. That one of those schools, Evergreen State College, that was created in the 60s with the idea of experiential learning.
Cool.
And at the Evergreen State College, so I'm a greener. And what that meant was that I didn't have grades. And at the end of every quarter, we would be asked to write a reflection on our work, how engaged we were, how committed we were, really deeply reflect on our own performance. Mm-hmm. And we would take that into our professor and share that document with our professor. And at the same time, my professor would share back with me their thoughts on how I performed, what they saw in me. And I can't say what a big deal this was, that in one of these we call them self-evaluations, that I was sharing with my professor, she's a phenomenal scientist. And so I wrote how that quarter I had really just lost myself in my work and in the data I had collected. And she looked at me and she said, "Have you ever thought about being a scientist?" And I in that moment, I thought, absolutely not. No, like it's not a thing. I've never known a scientist except for you, and you're sitting across from me and you're this amazing woman, but I could never be that. And it was a little seed in my mind at that point, in this experiential learning environment where I wasn't being evaluated by my grades, and I was encouraged to be curious, and I was encouraged to ask questions that really planted the seed of where I am today. And it's really amazing to me to look back and think, it only takes one word, one sentence from a mentor to encourage or even discourage you. And I was fortunate enough to be encouraged by that.
Kind of jumping around a bit, but I know you've had a great career teaching. That's just one part of a long career you've had. But when you come across or have come across college kids that maybe seem to be kind of spinning their wheels a little bit or can't quite figure out where they fit into the world, and you've had this pretty cool experience, and you're obviously really good at talking about it. Do you have any kind of standard advice you give to college kids who are looking to kind of find what they're supposed to be doing with their life?
Yes, absolutely. And for this generation, especially, that my biggest piece of advice, and I usually would stand up in front of my class at the beginning of every semester and say, you are more than your grades. You are more than your performance. And they haven't been told this. They need to be told this over and over again, because in so many ways, this generation has been treated as a project of performance, from and professionalizing youth sports to youth academics to youth music, youth theater, that just to give them that space to be curious, to explore, to ask questions, and to not really focus so much on their performance is one of the most important things I say to this generation.
Yeah, my wife has spent a decent amount of her career in higher ed, kind of higher ed adjacent, working with college or kids that are applying to college. And there does seem to be this intensity now that comes with this, I guess the last maybe 10 or 12 years of, we talked about you can't really see the line until you're looking back, and they're trying to draw the line ahead of time, and they're trying to be the best at every single thing. And it seems like a lot of them, they're 18 years old and they're freshmen in college and they're already burned out at that point because it's so performance based.
Yeah. And even people that are in higher ed call those students toasties because they're so toasted by the time they get to undergrad. And it's something that I just feel like in terms of working with students, because it's been so performance-based, there are students that we're leaving behind. And every day in the classroom, I would think about who is being excluded from this classroom at any point in time. So my whole classroom would be structured around active learning, asking questions, being curious, not having high-stakes exams, and giving them a safe space to explore as much of the world as we could together in 15 weeks.
That's so cool. I wish I'd had professors like you.
Yeah.
So, all right, you have this kind of moment where the seed was planted about science. Where did it go from there? I mean, what was the route to kind of devoting your professional career to that?
Well, once that seed was planted, what I realized is that I didn't know what science was. I didn't realize that it was a creative. It was for people that just ask questions all the time. Like, what a privilege to be able to be a curious person. And I've been asking questions about the world my entire life. And then to be able to have a career doing that. Because what I'd previously thought is that I had to be a science nerd that loved all my science classes. So my deep, dark secret is that I didn't really like taking classes. I didn't enjoy sitting in a lecture and just sitting there passively and listening to someone talk. And I wasn't inspired to learn and to engage until I was asked to do that, where I would be going out and doing field work and collecting data and coming back and putting my own creative thought into that. So once I knew what science was, and I knew it was creative and it was built for people that were super inquisitive, even slightly obsessive sometimes about asking questions, I knew that was a great place for me. So after that, I went on the track for my master's degree, went to the University of California at Berkeley, and then I did my PhD at Colorado State University. And just, once I got into the mindset that I get to ask questions and I get to be curious, it completely shifted the landscape for me. That, of course, I had to take some classes, But I was like, okay, these classes are just for me to still be able to ask questions and be curious.
And so as your career kind of evolved, particularly at University of Colorado, how did you think about research and doing your own research? And I know you've got tons of peer-reviewed papers versus teaching, because it seems like you've got a passion for both and that you're really good at both. I mean, and I know sometimes you talk to folks in academia and they prefer one or the other, but it seems that you like and are really good at both. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, it was one of those things. Being at a research institution, there is a culture of come in and, we really hired you for your research and to be an expert and to be at the leading edge of our knowledge in a certain area and to become internationally recognized. And we also expect you to care about students and to be a strong educator. What wasn't the expectation, though, was that that we do a deep dive into the scholarship of teaching and learning and treat teaching in a way that I would teach my research. Mm-hmm. That I taught my teaching and the importance of my teaching and put it on equal footing as my research of like, okay, I'm going to try this in my classroom. I'm going to do this experiment. I'm going to collect data. I'm going to see if that worked with my students, and I'm going to come back and revise it. And that was not common at that point. And I early on in my career, before tenure, there were some questions of like, do you really want to spend all of your time and effort and energy doing that? And for me, given where I came from, where I'd gotten to, and knowing what I knew about how people learn, there was never any question. There was never any question that I was going to commit significant time to teaching in the classroom.
And thinking about where you are now, with so many years of experience behind you, and then, thinking about your first few years when you were a full-time professor, like, what was the results of those experiments? Like, how did you get better? How are you a different professor now than you were then? I mean, we could talk about that for hours, I would imagine, but any big kind of aha moments when it comes to teaching and kind of being able to explain all this stuff to people in a way that engages them and gets them excited? Because I think that leads into your work today in a lot of ways.
I think the most important thing I learned was to connect with people at a deeper level and as humans. And so when you think about your own experiences in the classroom over, I'm sure, many of years of education. Oftentimes when you're a professor or an expert, you're expected to go up there and share your knowledge, inspire people, but you're not always asked to connect emotionally with people, connect with them about their lives, connect with people and students on the experiences that they have when they walk in that door every day. And so that was the most important thing I learned. So I started off lecturing like everyone else, and I was so uncomfortable because I knew that didn't work for me as a student. Yeah. So then I started changing things, and I said, okay, I'm going to put my lecture online, and I want you to watch it and then come in, and then we're going to work together. And so that's called a flipped classroom. It's much more common now than it was, back in 2010 when I started it.
Okay.
And so a lot of students would just look at me and ask, what are you doing? This is not normal. What are you doing to me? My favorite one was someone would come into my office hours and they'd say, I have a 3.9 GPA. And I would say, that's awesome. But I'm not doing well right now. And I was like, let's talk about that. Why? And so what I found is that once I started teaching that way and opening it up, those students who had the system dialed in were a little upset because they're like, I have the system. I know the system, and you're not teaching to the system. And then and they'd be a little upset. But the ones that had not benefited from our educational system for so many years,
yeah,
would come in and just have so much gratitude to be able to feel safe in these environments and to show what they could do.
I love that, and in so many ways, I feel like that should be the point of college is because so many of these kids are so smart. I wasn't super smart, but I was really good at figuring out what was required to do well. Like I was a really good test taker, and I could kind of figure out like what is the system here? Like, what do I need to do? And it was more about beating the system or thriving within the system than actually learning. And so I think I could have benefited from a teacher like you kind of shaking up that worldview, because I feel like my career really took off when I was just fully focused on what I wanted to learn and following my own curiosity versus checking the boxes, So I feel like that is such an important life skill that you were teaching those folks. It went far beyond science,
Absolutely.
So we could keep talking about, I'm fascinated by teachers and educators and people that are able to connect with folks. But again, I think this really fits in with what you're doing now with TNC. So I think that's really important groundwork. But you were obviously fully focused on being an educator, being a researcher. You loved it. You were learning. It sounds like it was really just more than a full-time job. I'd love to know when TNC came into your purview and how you decided to start devoting some of your professional energy towards TNC on top of everything else.
Well, during my research, I had a lot of curiosity, like I said, but my research was always grounded in how do I help solve a problem? And so I was never asking questions just out of curiosity. I was always asking a question, for example, of how can I help the Bureau of Land Management in the Western United States with this grazing issue? How do I help make them better decisions that will benefit the health of ecosystems, people, and communities? And it was from that place that I started building a relationship with the Nature Conservancy out in Utah. So much of my research over my career has been on the Colorado Plateau and out in Southeast Utah. I made some incredible friends and had great relationships out there with the Nature Conservancy, who run the Canyonlands Research Center. And exactly what I was trying to do as a researcher, they were trying to solve problems in terms of losing the health of the land and looking at the impacts of changing climate and increasing drought, and having increasing drought with the increases in potential flooding events, and really being engaged at the ground level of trying to use my science for solutions. Yeah. And that was just really those 10 years of working in partnership, here in the U.S. with the Nature Conservancy. At the same time, I started working with the United Nations, doing the same thing, asking at the global level, what are some of the solutions to addressing climate change and biodiversity loss, and how do we come together as a global community to really engage in those solutions on the ground. And it was really interesting. I think COVID was so interesting for many of us that during that time, I'd been giving all of these talks at the UN and also with TNC about, we have 10 years, that this is our moment of opportunity to address climate change and biodiversity loss. And I sat during COVID, in my house, and I thought, well, what should I be doing? Mm-hmm. I've had an amazing career as a professor, but should I be working at the front lines of conservation and providing and really engaging the research and the huge research endeavor of TNC to develop those, be much closer to the development of those solutions?
So with your current role at TNC, can you just kind of give a summary of the main things that you think about, the main things that you are focused on kind of in your strategic and tactical work?
Yeah, I think the simplest way to describe what I do is I wake up every day and I think about what is the science that the Nature Conservancy needs to have our greatest success in conservation.
Mm-hmm.
And I get the privilege of being on a team of amazingly talented scientists who, we get to think about that every day, is that what is the science this organization needs? And so that's not only today, over the next 6 months, over the next 12 months, but thinking 2030 and beyond. What is the science that we need to be doing today? What's the research that we need right now? What is the technical expertise in areas like artificial intelligence, machine learning that we need to have in place to be able to invest in some of these huge conservation decisions that we make all the time?
One specific thing that I'm curious about, that I've read a lot about, and I feel like just in the last maybe 5 years, it's become much in the forefront of discussions, is the need and importance of incorporating Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous science into the standard, kind of Western type science that's been used for the last 100 years or whatever. I was wondering if you could just kind of educate me on that as a overarching movement, and then specifically some of the stuff that you're working on in that arena.
Yes, I would be happy to, but I also want to first recognize that I am at a point in time on this day that we're talking that I'm on my own learning journey. Yes. On what it means to incorporate Indigenous knowledge or weave Indigenous knowledge into one of the world's largest conservation organizations. Sure. So what I can do is describe a little bit of my journey over the last couple of years and how it has, I would have to say, fundamentally shifted the way I see problem solving, conservation, science, how I ask questions.
That's a big statement.
It is. It is a big statement. Yeah.
I love that. And especially coming from somebody as curious as you, like that's, that I can't wait to hear it. I'll be quiet now.
Oh yeah. So what happened a couple years ago is that we had an opportunity out at the Canyonlands Research Center to create a summer program for Indigenous students. And I saw this great opportunity to have 6 or 7 students come out to Dugout Ranch, which is near Indian Creek and Canyonlands National Park, to spend the summer learning about land management, natural resource management, learning about plant soils, wildlife communities. And in my mind, this was in the hopes of that there are all of these federal jobs out in the Four Corners region where many of these Dene and Hopi students are from. Mm-hmm. And so it started with writing the first advertisement. And in the ad for students for this first cohort, I wrote, "You will learn about land management." So we're going to put a pin in that.
Okay. And
fast forward about 6 weeks, and I have my first cohort of students, and I asked the question on day one, why are you here? What made you interested in this, in this summer program? And Benjamin raised his hand, one of my favorite students, creative writing student. He wasn't even in environment and sustainability or natural resource management. And he raised his hand and he said, "Well, I looked at your ad and I thought to myself, what is land management?" And so in that moment, I recognized my whole framework for natural resource management, environment, conservation was not even the right entry point. Mm-hmm. And so I backed up and I said, "Tell me what land means to you." And this is one of my favorite questions I ask audiences now when I give talks. What does land mean to you? What does water mean to you? What does the ocean mean to you? And so after asking students at universities studying kind of mainstream science, biology degrees versus Indigenous students and Indigenous colleagues, you can imagine I get very different answers. And what I learned is that the clear kinship relationship to land. So Benjamin said, "Well, I see land as mother, of course, and as a friend. And so I started this, that really started my journey into thinking, what would it look like if all of us had a kinship relationship view of the world, of to our environment or to nature? And in some Indigenous languages, there's not even a word for nature.
Mm-hmm.
And that experience with those students really started this journey into thinking about how do we, we always say that TNC is a science-based organization. We came out of the Ecological Society of America as a professional science organization 70 plus years ago. And what does it mean right now in 2024 to shift our view to a more Indigenous view of conservation? And so that's been a journey of mine, talking with and meeting with Indigenous scholars over the last year, working with my colleagues within TNC and the Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities team to really explore that question, and also to sit in ceremony with Indigenous leaders and to listen. And so that's where I am here today at this moment, and thinking about what that looks like. And the answer that is evolving, which is not somewhere that I expect it to be, is asking the question, what does it mean to approach this work with love and with responsibility?
And so how has that manifested? I mean, I know we're still in the early stages, and it's a journey, and it'll be interesting. I'd love to connect with you in like 5 years and see what,
Yes.
where, how it's evolved in unexpected ways from there. But, are there any examples? I mean, I had like, Celine and Isabella on the podcast, and we talked about we gave high level discussions about some of the stuff happening at Zapata Ranch. And so we've hit on some of these topics before, but I'd love to hear any specific examples that maybe you're working on, or folks that your teammates with at TNC are working on, where this is kind of a concrete example of how this is coming together at TNC.
So for me right now, the most important thing is that we're building our science capacity in this area. So we just hired our first global director of Indigenous sciences, and cool. He was a professor at a university, and he is just transitioning from that role into the organization to help us, to really help us scope what it means to engage in the Indigenous sciences. And so right now, I'm not working on a specific project. There's just so much, so many projects engaging with Indigenous communities within TNC. But what we're doing is thinking about the broader scope of, within many of our projects is taking, like, how would we ask questions that interweaves Indigenous science and traditional ecological knowledge with the more traditional mainstream science approaches that we take, that we're well trained in, that we take every day.
There's a book I read. I don't know. You may enjoy it. It's by a guy named David Gessner, who's been on this podcast a few times, and he's talking about the book is actually about Theodore Roosevelt and his conservation journey, but there's a big portion of it centers around the Bears Ears Monument, which you're obviously very familiar with. And Gessner is he loves TR and loves the big personality and all that, but he's also very realistic about TR's shortfalls and the things that he was not great at. And one of the things he was not great at was his relationship with Native Americans. But he talks about Bears Ears as, TR used to say that national parks were America's best idea. And he's like, well, I don't know if we'd say best idea. It's a pretty good idea. and then he talks about Bears Ears, and he refers to it as having a confluence of conservation ideals because it combines some of the best parts of Western, kind of classic TR type conservation with indigenous knowledge and combines them into this thing where the sum is bigger than the parts in a lot of ways. And I feel like that's kind of what you're doing on the science side of things, of taking these two different systems that are pretty different and combining them in a way to make something that's even better, which I think is very exciting, but also probably very daunting as well.
Well, and it's interesting that when you think about indigenous knowledge, that you have people that have been living on these lands since time immemorial, and they are really our first scientists that have been collecting data and through oral tradition, and obviously different traditions than we have in mainstream science, but that this data collection that is then followed through oral traditions of how you live with the land and in relationship with the land, is that it's daunting in one way, but at the same time, for me, in my mind, it seems like a very natural relationship and progression. Mm-hmm. That as scientists, we do really well. Like I do really well in measuring plants within a plot. I can do that really well over a 3 to 5 year funding cycle. But think about what I miss as a scientist of all the rich additional information that exists on these lands, oceans, and waters. And that is one thing, going back to my early time with the Nature Conservancy and working at Dugout Ranch with Heidi Red and her family, is that I could be doing a 3 to 5 year project, but Heidi could come in and say, you know what I've noticed over the last 50 years? And so her relationship to the land so enriched my view of the world as a scientist. And so bringing all of that together, the potential power we have in working together with all these different type of knowledges is, I think, extraordinary.
And for people who want to dig deep into Heidi Red and her story at the Dugout Ranch, I did a podcast maybe 2 months ago with her, and she wrote an amazing book that TNC published as well, which we talk about. So moving on to another subject that I'm interested in, with TNC, obviously conservation, people were thinking about wildlife, biodiversity, people were thinking about, everything from the most basic conservation easement to this really intense science that you work on. But I know that TNC also has started, making a concerted effort really to put people more front and center. It's not so much animals and land, but there's people and human health is almost one of the center points of what y'all are doing. And so can you talk a bit about that? I don't know if you'd call it a transition, but that initiative that you guys are focused on.
Yeah. And what I want to start with is the evolution in conservation and working in environment and sustainability is that, we've spent many years looking at the impacts of humans on lands, the impacts of humans on waters and oceans. But there has been a lot less time and investment into understanding the root causes. And so that's really thinking about the investing in understanding in the social sciences, like what are the demographic changes or the economic changes, cultural education that is driving these impacts to our environment. And so our new planetary and human health initiative, which we're super excited about, is thinking about how do we understand the root causes of some of those impacts on our lands, and also impacts not only on ecosystems, but on people. And so there's so many important stories that have deep meaning to people when we start thinking about human health, their mental and physical well-being. And we're so intricately connected to the health of our ecosystems. But traditionally, conservation hasn't really looked at those questions or told those stories. And that's something that we're really excited to do. This one example of a recent paper that we published is looking at the smoke emissions from Western fires and how the smoke emissions change and whether or not it's been treated or thinned or you've had prescribed burning. What was interesting and what they showed is that if you treat some of these forests by thinning and prescribed burning today, you're going to have less smoke emissions over the next 40 years, which then, this is the interesting part, has where they modeled the effects on emergency department visits with asthma-related emergency department visits.
Oh, wow.
And so this is just an example that we're not only doing, we usually tell the story about this is going to be good for the health of the forests, but treating forests and managing the forests is also good for the health of communities because you're reducing smoke emissions over the longer term.
And yeah, I mean, you just think about this work, and that's at the end of the day, the result is the same from that, but it's just figuring out a different way to tell the story that's going to connect with people, which is obviously what you've kind of been doing your whole career in a lot of different forms. This is kind of a big question, but it's just on my mind, so I'm going to ask it. When you think about, I'm thinking about climate specifically, but in your world, it's a lot more complicated and there's a lot more going on than just to call it climate, whether you talk about biodiversity loss, just the general health of the planet. It seems like you're on the cutting edge of a lot of very, very, very interesting and effective work that's making things better. But then on the other side of things, when I read books or when I watch the news, which I rarely do because it makes me so depressed, you hear just the worst things in the world and that we're all doomed. And so are you optimistic about about where we're going with this and the chances of kind of righting the ship? I mean, what is your mood over? I mean, you seem like an optimist, kind of that's just your operating system, but these are some big challenges. And how do you think about it?
That is such a good question. And what we do know is that the doom and the gloom associated with it is not an effective motivator for people.
Yeah.
And I fully acknowledge that we are in a tough space right now in terms of climate change and biodiversity loss. But the but is that we like cycling in the fear and the grief, even though I think it's important to acknowledge, is not any like for me as a scientist to go out there and say, the world is ending. Prepare yourself. It's not an effective motivator for people to have hope. It's not a motivator for change. And so I believe very strongly in this is that we, even though it's, there's so much out there. And I would even say, like you said, I don't know if you said you don't watch the news, but I think we need to limit some of our exposure to social media, news, the doom and gloom, because it can take us to a place that for our own mental and physical well-being is it's counterproductive, and you can end up getting into these cycles of fear and loss and grief. And I am an optimist, and I do believe that we are running as fast as we can in terms of our energy transitions. And at TNC, we believe in using the power of nature here and now to mitigate some of the most dramatic effects of climate. Like how do we use the power of photosynthesis and the power of our ecosystems to buy us some time right now to draw some of that carbon out of the atmosphere in order to put other systems in place to be able to keep our warming to a level that our systems are, really made for. Mm-hmm. So, I just really strongly believe that if you can, buffer yourself from some of the fear and doom and gloom is the best thing that we can all do for ourselves.
Yeah, I really, I don't look at the news after that terrible Uvalde school shooting. I just shut it all down and I don't look. But every now and then there will be like over the last month or so, I've peeked back at online news and I can tell pretty quickly, like within a matter of hours, of what it does to my brain. And
yes,
and so it's kind of it could be considered a privileged position to not have to pay attention to any of that stuff, but that's what I do, and I have to, or else I'm gonna lose my mind. Along those lines, I mean, obviously you're deep in the science, and you're getting a lot of information, directly from scientific sources, but just in your day to day, taking in kind of mainstream type information about science and about conservation, about your work, are there any particular places where you find yourself going, whether that's online or whether that's podcast or things that are not, straight up scientific journals? But I'd love to know just kind of where you get your information that allows you to continue being so optimistic and productive.
Oh, that's such a good question. You're asking me this since I've been on a media blackout since after the election.
Nice. Well, you've got a very clear head. Does anything come? Is there any good spots we can go online where we can learn stuff without losing our minds?
One place that I've been going to is some of the business clients. So Bloomberg Climate, for example, has a lot of kind of economics and business good news of, how quickly we are transitioning in terms of clean energy. And so that's one, but this has just been the last couple weeks. That you have asked me a very hard question of where do I go to for hopefulness? And
I think that speaks more to the system than to me or you. Because that's why I asked, because I don't know. I don't have an answer. Like I had to make up my own weekly email of good news because I couldn't. It's like a treasure hunt to try to find good news.
Well, you know what my answer is that we're very heady, nerdy, kind of ready people. Like we're like have tendencies that direction, and so where I'm navigating to right now is to people and to just being with people, being in conversation, and going into environments that I go with a open and whole heart. I'm be vulnerable, be compassionate. And so any time that I spend huge amounts of time reading and all sorts, different news resources. And really over the last few weeks, I've been just trying to take that time and connect with people.
Yeah. When you think about your work and you think about everything you're doing at TNC, there's so much exciting stuff on the horizon. Are there any projects or initiatives that we haven't talked about that are worth mentioning, that are making you optimistic and also kind of making headway on all these pretty big, important issues?
I love that question. And being at TNC, it's always an overwhelming question because I'm like, which one do I pick? There's so many amazing projects. There's so many exciting things that I wake up to every day. And for me and where I sit within my science team, I think the exciting part is thinking about how we collaborate across traditional ecological knowledge to climate science, to biodiversity science, to economics and governance, and the broader human dimension science. And that's what I'm most excited about, is thinking about how do we take the power of all of these disciplines working together to, think about projects in Africa, Latin America, Asia Pacific. And so we think a lot about, because the U.S. is such a powerhouse in science, how we support our colleagues in underrepresented parts of where science isn't a powerhouse across the world, and underrepresented, under-resourced business units across the world, and how we bring that strength of that multidisciplinary approach to solving some of these, huge problems in Latin America, Africa, and Asia Pacific.
So people are going to be listening to this, or I think about if I were listening to this and I was not involved in any way in this podcast, I'm listening. I'm like, this is all really, really interesting. And I'm so happy they're doing all this cool work. And she just seems like such a cool person. And I wish I'd had a college professor like that. And then I might just wander off and nothing would really change. And so in the spirit of solving problems, of making changes, people that are listening to this, they're, overall, I'm just amazed by the listeners of this podcast, because they're all so kind and curious, hardworking, just a really amazing group of people, at least all of them that I've interacted with. What is something that a person who's listening to this that may not be in any way involved in conservation or science or anything, like what's something they could do that would help, whether it's help your work, help TNC's work, or just in general, make the world a little bit better? As a scientist, what would you recommend that somebody could do to take action?
Yeah, you mentioned this already, but I really feel that we have such amazing members at TNC. And so it's a global community. And so any help that we get would be fantastic. Like, just get involved in your local TNC chapter would be fantastic. But, I get asked this question all the time, and I just think about, if you can just think about, where am I traveling this year? What is my carbon footprint for some of the flights I'm taking? Could I do something different with my family that could be as rewarding and as gratifying? Also looking at, I think about this a lot, and we all have different ways that we feel like we can have an impact. So, for example, I have a really strong plant-based diet, and I think about, that's one of my main contributions to thinking about how we reduce greenhouse gas emissions and shifting to more of a plant-based diet. Also thinking about our just general consumption patterns. And we know that, there's this constant tension that I've seen in assessments that I've been on for land degradation, biodiversity loss, about world population, but also consumption. And in living in the United States, one of the most important things that we can do is really take a critical eye to our consumption and our needs. And, how much more do we need in our lives once our basic needs are met? So that's my best answer to what is also often a really tough question. And again, it's also connecting with people, and those of you that are listening, you all have influence in your lives, and families and friends and churches and other networks. And so thinking about what is your zone of influence for the greater good of the world.
You know what I just started doing to try to take action, a very small step, but I think it's going to make a little bit of impact, is composting. My wife's
fun.
Yeah,
it's so
my
fun.
wife was hardcore about it for so long, and I would just kind of complain about it and like never take it out and all this kind of stuff. And then I read Mark Easter's book and learned about all the methane that gets produced from kitchen scraps. And I was like, all right, that's a little thing I can do that I think is going to make a decent impact, at least in our little household. And it's a lot better than just sitting around thinking about stuff and worrying. I got serious compost going. I'm gonna have an awesome garden next year. So
oh yeah, it's so interesting, and the science behind composting is so interesting.
Throw some worms in there. Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Since the very first sentence you said, or one of the first 10 sentences, I've been excited to ask you this question. I love books. I love reading, just like you. It's big thankfully, my girls love it as well. It's like a big part of everything we do in this family. And it's one of the reasons I started this podcast, really, is I'm always trying to find out the books that people read that have allowed them to do the work they do and live the lives that they live. And I know this would be a big question for you, but they don't have to be about science. They don't have to be about conservation. I'm just interested to know any books that you have read that you consider to be kind of foundational books in your evolution as a human.
Oh, that's such a great question.
We could do a whole podcast about that.
Yeah, we could do a whole podcast on that. But what I want to do is give you a couple books that have really, in this phase of the last couple of years for me, have really informed my thinking about who I am as a person, who I am as a leader. Where am I at this point in mid-career in my life? And one is the Gifts of Imperfection by Brene Brown.
Mm-hmm.
And this has really shifted my thinking about entering spaces like this, just talking with you today about like who I am authentically as a whole person, entering today with love in my heart and with a whole heart, and being willing to, be vulnerable, not be scared to be on a podcast, and also feel self-compassion for myself, that to wake up every day and to be able to say, oh my gosh, I have so much to do. I'm so behind, and rather shaming myself is just to be compassionate with myself. So that has been really instrumental for me over the last couple of years. And the other one, the second book that has been really important to me is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman.
Oh, I haven't read that, but I've heard such good things about it.
Oh, it's so great because this dates back to my time during teaching, and to be thinking about, how do people make decisions? When you look at students or people in your life, you're like, how did they get there? How did they make that decision? So it's really the deep dive into the psychology and of how people make choices, and how people make decisions. And so it's drawing, I love it because it draws on both psychological research and economic theory. Mm-hmm. And it also shows me as a scientist how people are not great because of these two types of systems operating in their brain: the fast, intuitive system that takes shortcuts and has a lot of biases, versus that reasoning, slower system to understand how people make decisions. And that's been I love to understand more about people. And that's been a fantastic way to do that, is through that book.
Yeah, I need to read that. It's been on my list for so long. That's a great reminder. All right, final question. The people, as I mentioned, the people that listen to this podcast, they're so curious, so interesting. They love the American West. They love land, and it could be through work in conservation, could be through art, could be through athletics. It's just really a pretty amazingly broad sampling of people that feel connected to the West in one way or another. And so I always like to ask if I missed anything, if you have any parting words of wisdom, any way you'd like to wrap it up. Again, we might need to go ahead and schedule part 2 and 3 and 4 because there's a lot more to talk about. But yes. Any kind of parting words to wrap it up?
I would say that we're in a very significant time of change right now. And that my parting words of wisdom is to, if you wake up in the morning and you feel that fear in your heart, is to, think about how you would embrace that, knowing that we're in a time of change, and embrace hope, optimism, find moments of joy, and find connection with people. Because I really do think that in this time of change, we need to reach out and wrap our arms around each other. And that's really my parting words and gift.
I love it. Nichole, this was so fun. I feel like you're my new best friend.
Same. Absolutely.
I really loved it. Thank you for taking the time to do it. And I hope we can hang out in person in Boulder one of these days, but keep up the great work.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I so enjoyed our conversation.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number three, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number four, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way, so head to mountainprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.